Did you know that one mistake could cost millions of lives? In this story, the USA decided the fate of the war in just a few days. If you're interested in the truth about World War II, subscribe and hit the like button. There are many shocking facts ahead. Imagine standing in a dimly lit underground bunker, the air thick with the scent of oil and volcanic dust. The date is February 19, 1944, and we are in Rabaul, New Britain, deep within the fortified heart of the Japanese Empire in the South Pacific. Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka's hand quivered ever so slightly as he scribbled in his private journal words so damning that, if ever discovered by the imperial headquarters, would have condemned him to a court-martial without hesitation. He wrote, "The Americans are not fighting us. They are strangling us. Each bypassed garrison is another weight dragging the empire toward the ocean floor." Through the narrow, claustrophobic ventilation shaft, the distant, monotonous rumble of B-24 Liberators reached him, their passage as predictable as the sunrise. These milk runs, as the Americans called them, had become a daily reminder that Rabaul, once a jewel of the Imperial Navy, was no longer worth capturing. 100,000 Japanese troops, elite soldiers of both Army and Navy, sat trapped on this volcanic island, watching the enemy sail past, heading straight for Japan itself. Picture it, Rabaul, a fortress once considered the crown jewel of the South Pacific, developed into a major fleet base, bristling with defenses now rendered impotent without a single shot fired in anger. What unnerved Kusaka more than any Banzai charge or naval bombardment was this new, terrifying form of warfare, one that rendered decades of Japanese defensive doctrine obsolete. The Americans weren't fighting by the rules of Bushido. They weren't seeking glory or honor. Instead, they methodically dismantled the Japanese Empire not through direct confrontation, but through strategic neglect. Strength became weakness. Fortresses became prisons. The arithmetic of defeat was no longer measured in bloodshed alone. It was written in shipping manifests that would never arrive, in airfields that would never again launch Zeros, in soldiers dying not by bullets, but by disease, starvation, and irrelevance. The Japanese defensive strategy, conceived with cold elegance in the halls of Imperial General Headquarters, was a masterpiece of symmetry. Each island a floating fortress, each garrison a blade pointed at the American advance. The plan relied on the enemy attacking, on them bleeding against steel and spirit. In September 1943, Lieutenant General Hideki Tojo had proclaimed the absolute national defense zone, a defensive perimeter stretching from the southern half of Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands through the Bonins, the Marianas, western New Guinea, Malaya, and Burma. Every strong point was to be held to the last man. Every island was to become a fortress. Every grain of sand was to be paid for in blood. At Rabaul, General Hitoshi Imamura commanded 50,000 elite soldiers of the 8th Area Army. The harbor bristled with 367 anti-aircraft guns. 5 airfields could launch hundreds of aircraft. The network included pre-war Australian strips at Lacune and Vanukanal, Rapopo operational since December 1942, with concrete runways and extensive maintenance facilities, and Tobera, completed in August 1943. Underground tunnels carved through volcanic rock linked defensive positions, hospitals, and supply depots for miles. "Rabaul is impregnable," Imamura wrote to Tokyo in November 1943. "The Americans will shatter themselves against our defenses like waves against a seawall." But what neither Imamura nor Imperial headquarters understood was this: the Americans had no desire for such a glorious battle. The revelation of this new strategy began quietly, almost insidiously, in June 1943. disguised as victory. If you were Kusaka, trapped in that bunker, watching your empire slowly wither while your fortress roared silently around you, what would you feel? Helplessness, rage, or a cold, creeping fear that the very rules you had lived by no longer applied? Picture yourself on a quiet, sun-drenched beach of an unremarkable island in the South Pacific on June 30th, 1943. To the Japanese commanders in Rabaul, the news was at first a cause for celebration. American forces had landed on Woodlark and Kirawina Islands, sparsely defended outposts far from the heart of Japanese power. Surely, they thought, this confirmed what Captain Toshio Takahashi, intelligence officer at Rabaul, had observed. The enemy lacks the stomach for heavy combat. They nibble at the edges like mice afraid of the lion. But a nagging unease crept in. These weren't just incidental attacks. The Americans were choosing islands where they could build airfields positioned for operations that had nothing to do with assaulting Japanese fortresses. What was the enemy planning? What game were they playing that didn't fit the expected pattern of honor-bound warfare? The unease turned into alarm on the same day with the invasion of New Georgia. Here, the Japanese had 10,500 troops anchored around the vital airfield at Munda Point. Finally, a real battle won that tested men and strategy alike. Yet after weeks of savage fighting that stretched into August, the Americans captured the airfield and then stopped. They did not chase down the retreating Japanese, did not attempt to clear the entire island. They simply fortified Munda and moved on. Major Kenji Hatano, who survived the campaign, reported back to Rabaul. The Americans fight differently. They take what they need and leave us the rest. It is as if we don't matter to them. By November 1943, the unsettling pattern revealed itself with horrifying clarity. Operation Cartwheel, the American offensive, was not designed to capture Japanese bases. It was designed to render them irrelevant. Admiral Minechi Koga, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, responded with urgency to the Allied invasion of Bougainville. On November 1, 1943, he transferred 173 carrier aircraft 82 Zeros, 45 Type 99 dive bombers, 40 Type 97 torpedo bombers, and 6 reconnaissance planes from the carriers Zuikaku, Shokaku, Zuiho, Junyu, Hiyu, and Ryuhu to reinforce Rabaul. These were the last of Japan's trained carrier pilots, the same veterans who had struck Pearl Harbor, ravaged Ceylon, and fought at Midway, the sharpest edge of Japanese naval aviation, now committed to defending a fortress the Americans had no intention of assaulting. The American response was swift and punishing. On November 5th, carrier planes from USS Saratoga and Princeton struck Rabaul, severely damaging 4 heavy and 2 light cruisers. 6 days later, they returned with Essex, Bunker Hill, and Independence, crippling most remaining warships. And then they left. They did not invade. They did not press their advantage. The Japanese were left to contemplate the destruction of 121 of their 173 carrier aircraft and 82 of 193 aircrew. Commander Yasuo Kuwahara, a Zero pilot who survived the November raids, captured the psychological paradox in a letter found after the war. We won. We drove them off, so why does it feel like we lost? They damaged our ships, shot down our planes, and sailed away. We cannot chase them. We cannot strike back. We can only wait for them to come again. Lieutenant Commander Toshikazu Omae, Senior Staff Officer of the Southeast Area Fleet, began meticulously recording the tangible effects of this bypass strategy. His reports, classified at the time and captured after the war, read like a grim ledger of strategic strangulation. November 1943, Rabaul receives 30,000 tons of supplies monthly, fuel reserves at 60%, ammunition adequate for 6 months of combat. December 1943, supply convoys increasingly threatened. American submarines sink 2 vessels for every one that arrives. Monthly deliveries fall to 18,000 tons. January 1944. No surface vessels reach Rabaul in 3 weeks. Only submarine deliveries totaling 2,000 tons. Fuel reserves dropped to 30%. By February 1944, Japanese High Command made the grim calculation. No more fighters or bombers would be sent to Rabaul. Reinforcing the isolated garrison was futile. The mathematics were merciless. Without supplies, even the strongest fortress becomes a prison. Captain Takeo Takagi, commanding a destroyer squadron at Rabaul, faced an impossible dilemma. He had fuel for perhaps one major sortie, but where could he go? The Americans had seized the Admiralty Islands, completing Rabaul's encirclement. Every sea lane led to enemy-controlled waters. He wrote bitterly, "We are a fleet that cannot sail, warriors who cannot fight. We have become military theater, maintaining the pretense of threat while the real war passes us by." What the Americans had discovered, whether by genius or luck, was that the Pacific itself could defeat Japanese garrisons. Each bypassed island became a prison, a green hell where jungle, disease, and starvation replaced infantry. Dr. Shigeaki Yamauchi, chief medical officer at Rabaul, recorded the insidious decay of combat readiness. December 1943, malaria cases rising, quinine reserves for 4 months, combat readiness 85%. March 1944, 30% of garrisons stricken by malaria, dengue, or dysentery, quinine exhausted, limited substitutes used, combat readiness 60%. June 1944, malnutrition becomes primary concern. Rice rations cut to 400 grams daily, soldiers supplementing with jungle plants, some toxic. 17 deaths from poisonous vegetation in a single month. Step back for a moment and imagine it. Tens of thousands of elite soldiers, armed and drilled, trapped on a volcanic island fortress cut off, starving, plagued by disease, while the enemy moves past them untouched, unbothered. This is not a battlefield of bullets and glory. It is a battlefield of patience, attrition, and psychological terror. Combat readiness, 40%. Time had been transformed by the Americans into a fierce instrument of war. Each passing day gnawed at Japanese garrisons while U.S. forces grew stronger, vaulting from atoll to atoll, erecting airstrips and harbors, and knitting together an ever-expanding lattice of logistics, an infrastructure of victory, while isolated Japanese strongpoints quietly rotted beneath the tropic sun. Consider Wake Island. Bypassed since October 1943, it was no longer merely a waypoint in the Pacific. It had been turned into a fortress, girded with coastal batteries, anti-aircraft positions, and subterranean bunkers. Roughly 4,000 Japanese men remained under the command of Captain Shigematsu Sakaibara. Once, Wake had been a crucial refueling stop for trans-Pacific flights. Now, it was a sealed citadel the Americans chose to ignore. Sakaibara would only be promoted to Rear Admiral in October 1944. By then, the world he commanded had ceased to matter. His dispatches to Tokyo, sent piecemeal by the submarines carrying the radio parts, grew increasingly fraught. November 1943, enemy carrier aircraft struck installations. We await invasion force. All positions manned and ready. January 1944. No invasion materialized. Enemy ships passed by weekly, beyond the range of our coastal guns. Request instructions. April 1944. Food situation critical. Fishing helps, but is insufficient for the garrison. Many men show signs of malnutrition. When will relief come? Turn your gaze now to WWII Atoll in the Carolines, where 6,126 Japanese troops under Major General Katsumi Kitamura endured a similar fate. The Americans had seized neighboring islands to build runways. WWII's defenders were left to wither. Kitamura's war-worn diary, recovered after the fighting, reads like the logbook of a ship slowly taking on water, March 31st, 1944. The enemy task force sailed past again today, close enough to be seen in binoculars, but out of range of our guns. They do not even consider us worth destroying. May 15, 1944. Radio message states all available forces are being concentrated for a decisive battle. We are not included. We have become military orphans. August 2nd, 1944. Men have begun cultivating gardens. This is not a warrior's work, yet survival demands it. I fear we are becoming farmers, not soldiers. Ask yourself, what is the purpose of occasional carrier raids on these abandoned bastions? The answer is as psychological as it is physical. Those strikes did more than smash installations. They were reminders, blunt instruments of humiliation meant to show garrisons their impotence. Truk, once called Japan's Gibraltar in the Pacific, offers the starkest example. There, roughly 27,000 troops and the units of the Fourth Fleet had created what Japanese strategists regarded as an impregnable bastion. Yet on February 17-18, 1944, during Operation Hailstone, the U.S. Fast Carrier Task Force descended like a storm. Over 250 aircraft destroyed, 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers sunk, 32 merchant ships totaling some 200,000 tons lost, and approximately 4,500 Japanese personnel killed. Vice Admiral Masami Kobayashi, charged with Truk's defense, faced a commander's worst torment, irrelevance. His report to Combined Fleet Headquarters laid bare the psychological toll. American carriers appeared from nowhere, struck with overwhelming force, and vanished. We could not pursue. We could not retaliate. We could only endure and patch our losses, knowing they would return at will. This is not warfare, he wrote. This is torment. The same refrain echoed from Marcus Island to Palau and Yap. Periodic carrier attention, just enough to prevent thoughtful countermeasures, never enough to produce the honorable, decisive battles that Japanese commanders craved. Then came Saipan, the moment that made the island-hopping doctrine undeniable. When U.S. forces invaded on June 15, 1944, they brought an immense armada, over 300,000 men and more than 500 ships. Yet what truly haunted Japanese planners was not the assault on Saipan itself, but the host of fortresses the Americans had deliberately left untouched. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, who held Saipan's defense, received his final situation report on July 6, 1944, days before his last banzai charge. It was a ledger of paralysis. Truk, 27,000 troops isolated, no naval support possible. Rabaul, 100,000 troops isolated, reduced to growing vegetables. Wake, 4,000 troops isolated, surviving by fishing. Marcus, 4,000 troops isolated, water shortages critical. Wale, 6,426 troops isolated, starvation imminent. Over 200,000 Japanese soldiers, stocked with thousands of tons of ammunition, hundreds of planes, and elaborate fortifications, sat stranded while American forces advanced toward Japan. These were not merely unused troops. They had become liabilities, weapons turned into burdens, lives squandered by geography and logistics. And yet, not all commanders accepted this fate passively. When Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi arrived at Iwo Jima in June 1944, he brought with him a grim lesson learned from watching island hopping unfold. He saw the inevitability. The Americans would almost certainly invade Iwo Jima as a stepping stone to the homeland, and the assault would come soon. Kuribayashi did not prepare to cling to the beaches and die in traditional honor-bound fashion. He planned instead to make defeat count. Rejecting the classic beach defenses, he ordered an interior defense, some 18 kilometers of tunnels and roughly 5,000 cave positions carved under the island. In a letter to his wife, delivered only after his death, Kuribayashi explained his calculus plainly. "I do not fight to win. That is impossible. I fight to make the Americans pay such a price that they will think twice before invading Japan. Every Marine we kill here is one who cannot invade the homeland. We are not defending Iwo Jima. We are defending Japan with our deaths." That proclamation marked a seismic shift in Japanese military thought. Kuribayashi forbade banzai charges until the final hours. He judged them wasteful and instructed his men to fight as long as possible before being killed. The island-hopping campaign had taught them a bitter truth. Spectacular sacrifice meant little unless it served a larger strategic purpose. Commander Chihaya Takahashi, a staff officer who analyzed American tactics, penned a suppressed report that cut to the heart of the transformation. The Americans do not capture islands. They create floating bases. Each captured atoll becomes a fuel depot, each lagoon an anchorage, each airstrip a projection of power. They have made the Pacific a highway for their war machine. Liberty ships rolled out at industrial speed at peak, 3 vessels a day, while Japanese garrisons rationed the last sacks of rice as U.S. construction battalions poured concrete for runways capable of servicing 100-ton bombers. Captain Minoru Genda, the tactical mind behind Pearl Harbor, observed from Tokyo and reached a stark conclusion. We prepared for a war of warriors. They fight a war of engineers. While we perfect the art of dying, they perfect the art of supply. Each bypass garrison bled Japanese strength. Each new American airfield increased their reach. In short, time had become the enemy. Completing this noose around isolated garrisons was the submarine campaign. U.S. submarines turned resupply into a gamble with death. By 1944, they were sinking Japanese shipping faster than replacements could be built. Admiral Naokuni Nomura, overseeing submarine operations from Truk, chronicled the grim reality. Supporting bypassed garrisons had become, in many cases, physically impossible. Look again at the map. See how the sea that once connected empire had become its executioner, slow, patient, relentless. Imagine January 1944, the I-169, a submarine dispatched to resupply the garrison on Bougainville, is lost. 40 tons of supplies sinking into the Pacific with her. By February, I-43 is damaged by enemy aircraft approaching Rabaul, mission aborted. March sees I-42 sunk while evacuating key personnel from Wake Island. By April, submarine resupply missions are suspended indefinitely, risking valuable boats for minimal delivery is no longer justified. The lifeline that once connected these isolated garrisons had snapped. Each fortress, no matter how formidable on paper, was utterly alone. The consequences of this isolation became tragically clear in June 1944 at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Japanese naval aviation, already hollowed out by the bypassing of Rabaul, 121 of 123 veteran carrier pilots lost, was left with carriers filled with green, inexperienced pilots, many with fewer than 100 flight hours. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the mobile fleet, faced the impossible. The instructors who could have trained these pilots were dead or trapped on bypassed islands. The result was catastrophic. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, June 19, 1944. Japanese forces lost between 550 and 645 aircraft, 3 fleet carriers, Taiho, Shokaku, Hio, and roughly 3,000 personnel. American losses, 123 aircraft and 109 men. A 10-to-1 kill ratio, but it reflected not merely American superiority. It reflected the corrosive effect of the bypass strategy itself. In his after-action report, Ozawa wrote, "We have carriers without pilots, pilots without experience, experience without opportunity to gain it. The enemy's strategy has not just defeated us, it has made it impossible for us to become capable of victory. By mid-1944, an almost surreal transformation was underway across the Pacific. Elite troops, trained for the art of combat, were being converted into agricultural communes, struggling to survive rather than fight. At Rabaul, General Imamura issued orders that, just 2 years earlier, would have been unthinkable. Half of each day's daylight hours were to be devoted to growing food. Each soldier was instructed to cultivate 100 square meters of vegetables. Unit commanders were to be evaluated on harvest yields, not combat readiness. Rabaul, the fortress once intended to threaten Allied operations across the Pacific, had become a sprawling prison farm. Colonel Norio Kishimoto, commanding an infantry regiment, wrote in his diary, "My samurai ancestors would weep to see us. We who trained to die gloriously in battle now tend sweet potatoes and raise chickens. The Americans have not just defeated us, they have humiliated us with irrelevance." The same story unfolded elsewhere. On Volais, soldiers raised pigs. On Truk, they improvised fishing nets to catch what they could. On Wake, men attempted to grow vegetables in coral sand mixed with human waste. The mighty Imperial Japanese Army, which had conquered half of Asia, was reduced to subsistence farming, trapped on islands the Americans had chosen to bypass. Perhaps the cruelest element of this strategy was its gradual revelation. Many commanders did not immediately understand their predicament. Radio contact with Tokyo continued, orders were still issued, promotions announced, preserving the illusion of relevance while reality diverged completely. As late as December 1944, General Imamura at Rabaul received operational directives from Imperial General Headquarters. Prepare for coordinated offensive in conjunction with Philippine operations. Maintain readiness to interdict enemy supply lines. Orders to conduct offensive operations when no supply ship had arrived in 8 months illustrate the chasm between high command perception and battlefield reality. By April 1944, the last Japanese submarine had fled Rabaul. The final surface vessel had departed, and no aircraft had taken to the skies in over a month. By early 1945, the bypass strategy entered its cruelest phase. There was no formal operation targeting gardens, yet American forces periodically struck the agricultural efforts of the garrisons they had abandoned. B-24 bombers flattened the vegetable plot soldiers had painstakingly cultivated. Fighter sweeps strafed fishing boats, turning survival itself into a target. Picture it: men who had once trained to storm beaches, fight to the last man, and honor the empire now cowering in gardens, fishing from small boats, and watching the skies for bombers. The Americans had weaponized time, isolation, and neglect, turning hunger, disease, and boredom into instruments of war more effective than any frontal assault. The fortress of Rabaul, the fields of Volais, the coral sands of Wake, each had been transformed into a theater of slow death, and the island-hopping campaign was the stage on which it all played out. Imagine standing on a scorched, wind-whipped atoll in the Pacific, the ruins of carefully tended gardens smoking in the sun. Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamaguchi, agricultural officer at Volais, recorded his despair. 6 months of work destroyed in 10 minutes. The corn we nursed from seeds, the vegetables we watered with our drinking rations, all burning. The Americans didn't bomb our gun positions or ammunition dumps. They bombed our food. They know exactly what they're doing. Survival itself had become a target. By August 15, 1945, when Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, roughly 300,000 Japanese soldiers remained marooned on bypassed islands. At Rabaul alone, 69,000 troops endured, not through combat, but through gardens, fishing, and slow starvation. The surrender created a surreal limbo. Many garrisons refused to believe the news, convinced it was enemy propaganda. Others, even accepting the truth, had no one to surrender to. On Mila Atoll, Colonel Masashi Yamamoto faced this bitter reality. The war is over, but we have no one to surrender to. The Americans bypassed us so thoroughly they forgot we existed. We must wait for them to remember us. Some units lingered for weeks, even months, in this strange, suspended state, neither at war nor at peace. The Americans' perspective, in contrast, framed the strategy with chilling clarity. Admiral Chester Nimitz, architect of the Central Pacific Campaign, later reflected, "The quickest way to defeat Japan was not to fight the Japanese. Every bypassed island represented thousands of soldiers we didn't have to kill, tons of ammunition we didn't have to expend, American lives we didn't have to sacrifice. We turned their strength against them." General Douglas MacArthur, initially skeptical of bypassing major targets, eventually acknowledged its brilliance. Particularly after the decision to bypass Rabaul saved enormous Allied casualties. Yet, perhaps the most telling insight came from Admiral Matome Ugaki, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, who wrote in his February 1945 diary, "The Americans have discovered the perfect strategy against the Japanese warrior spirit. They have made our courage irrelevant, our fortifications useless, our Bushido meaningless. We prepared to die gloriously. They sentenced us to live shamefully. This is worse than defeat. This is erasure." The statistics underscore the devastating effectiveness of the strategy. Japanese forces bypassed included Rabaul, 100,000 troops initially, 69,000 at surrender, Truk 27,000 troops, WWII 6,426 troops, 1,050 survived to surrender, Wake 4,000 troops, Marcus 4,000 troops, various other garrisons, tens of thousands more, estimated total 300,000 Japanese troops neutralized without major combat. Of the 26 major bases bypassed, none meaningfully interfered with American operations once isolated. The psychological impact was perhaps even greater than the military. Japanese doctrine had always relied on decisive battle, spiritual superiority, overcoming material disadvantage. The Americans refused to grant them that battle. Fortifications, decades in the making, were left untested. Soldiers trained to die gloriously were sentenced instead to survive in irrelevance. Superior will, a core tenet of Japanese strategy, was rendered meaningless. Captain Yoshitaka Shindo, intelligence officer on bypassed Marcus Island, observed with striking clarity, "We were prepared for American strength. We were prepared for American technology. We were not prepared for American indifference. They have found the one thing the Japanese warrior cannot fight, being ignored." By late 1944, some Japanese commanders began to comprehend the new reality. But for most, it was already too late. Lieutenant General Kuribayashi at Iwo Jima applied the lessons of island hopping to his defense, planning not for victory, but for maximum cost to the attacker. No banzai charges, no futile attempts to hold beaches. Instead, a labyrinth of tunnels and fortified positions designed to make every American advance agonizingly expensive. His strategy extended what would have been a 5-day fight to 36 days, inflicting nearly 26,000 casualties, including 6,121 killed. General Holland Smith later called Kuribayashi the most redoubtable of all Pacific adversaries. Similarly, at Okinawa in 1945, Japanese defenders sought not to defeat the invasion outright, but to exact such a cost that America might seek negotiation over continued assault. The greatest irony of the island-hopping strategy was how it weaponized Japan's own warrior culture against itself. Each bypassed garrison that refused to surrender. Each soldier who clung to honor over pragmatism became a prisoner of circumstance. Survival, once a virtue, became a sentence. Gardens, fishing, improvised agriculture, these acts of resilience prolonged suffering, cemented irrelevance, and turned the pride of the Japanese Empire into a tableau of endurance without purpose. Time, geography, and American indifference had become the deadliest weapons of all. Imagine the sun sliding behind a coral ridge and the sound of waves filling the void where orders once rang clear. General Imamura, looking back after the war, put it bluntly, "We trapped ourselves with our own code. Surrender was impossible, retreat was forbidden, so we remained. The Americans didn't need to defeat us. We defeated ourselves by our inability to adapt to their strategy." For the men marooned on the bypassed atolls, the end of hostilities did not bring easy relief. At Rabaul, General Imamura and Admiral Kusaka formally yielded on September 6, 1945, aboard HMS Glory, yet they surrendered forces that had been strategically irrelevant for more than a year. Elsewhere, the endings were stranger still. On Anatahon Island, 32 Japanese soldiers refused to accept that the war had ended. They carried on patrols, polished their rifles, and kept military discipline against a phantom enemy until 1951. Think about that. 6 years of readiness for a battle that would never come. What does it say about the hold that duty, ritual, and honor had over them? How powerful must a strategic denial be to produce such an outcome? Beyond the tragedy of holdouts lay a cruelty of a different order. Combat, however brutal, could at least be framed as sacrifice death with purpose, an offering to the emperor. The bypassed garrisons were denied even that grim consolation. Private Kazuo Sakamaki, stationed at WWII, captured the emptiness. "We do not fear death. We fear meaninglessness. Every day we wake up, conduct military drills for battles that will never come, maintain weapons that will never fire, and pretend we are soldiers when we are actually prisoners of our own making." The medical records make the human cost undeniable. Malnutrition afflicted some 80% of troops. Disease rates exceeded 60%. Psychological disorders were widespread. Suicide rates rose sharply compared to frontline units. These are not abstract statistics, but the ledger of men whose lives were hollowed out by isolation, neglect, and an honor code that would not bend. Strategically, island hopping did more than win battles. It rewired the logic of war. It proved that holding a point on a map does not equal controlling a region. It demonstrated that industrial capacity and secure supply lines could overwhelm tactical advantages, and that time itself could be weaponized. Accelerate your own operations, delay the enemy's, and victory arrives without the pyrrhic cost of storming every fortress. Psychological impact the Americans showed can surpass physical destruction. Ignore an army long enough, and you make its courage irrelevant. General Imamura's later life bears the irony and the anguish of his command. In 1965, 20 years after the war, he published his memoirs. Convicted of war crimes, he had constructed a replica of his prison cell in his garden and lived there until his death in 1968. He donated all proceeds from his writings to families of Allied prisoners who had died under his authority. In those memoirs, he reflected both as a professional soldier and as a man scarred by defeat. "We studied Napoleon, Clausewitz, Sun Tzu. We prepared for every form of warfare we could imagine, but the Americans created a new form we never imagined. Warfare by avoidance, victory through irrelevance. They turned our greatest strength, our willingness to die for our positions, into our greatest weakness. At Rabaul, he remembered commanding 100,000 of Japan's finest, stocked with ammunition for years and fortifications meant to repel any assault. Yet none of it mattered. "We were an army of ghosts," he wrote, "haunting positions that no longer mattered, defending territory that had no value, waiting for battles that would never come." This was their genius. They made us defeat ourselves. Every day we held our positions. We weakened Japan. Every soldier growing vegetables at Rabaul was one not defending the homeland. We were not defeated. We were erased. If there is a lesson here for future commanders, Imamura insisted, it is not merely tactical, but conceptual. Study island hopping not only for the cleverness of its execution, but for its strategic revolution. The Americans taught the world that the best way to neutralize an enemy position is sometimes not to attack it, but to redefine victory, so that the position loses its purpose. They turned time, distance, and indifference into instruments of war. And in doing so, they forced a warrior culture to confront the most painful of outcomes. Not the shame of defeat in battle, but the endless humiliation of existing without meaning. So ask yourself, which is the harsher fate for a soldier trained to die with honor, an honorable death in battle, or years of tending gardens while the war moves on without you? The island hopping campaign offered an answer, cold and undeniable. Survival without purpose can be worse than death. Picture the vast Pacific, dotted with islands once bristling with the pride and power of the Japanese Empire, now silent except for the wind and the distant surf. Admiral Kusaka at Rabaul, reflecting in his final journal entry before surrender, crystallized the horror of what had happened. "The Americans have taught us the cruelest lesson of war, that there is something worse than death in battle, irrelevance in victory. We were the Emperor's finest warriors, reduced to growing sweet potatoes while the enemy sailed past us toward the homeland. We were prepared to die gloriously. Instead, we lived meaninglessly." This was the ultimate weapon of the island-hopping campaign, not bombs, bullets, or naval bombardments, but obsolescence itself. Every bypassed garrison, every soldier left on a forsaken atoll was made to confront the most painful defeat imaginable, not death, not capture, but erasure from the story of the war. The Americans did not defeat the Japanese strategy in conventional terms. They made strategy itself irrelevant. They transformed islands into highways rather than battlefields, fortresses into prisons of isolation, and warriors into shadows of themselves. Lieutenant Hiru Onoda's story on Lubang Island provides the starkest testament. Deployed on December 26, 1944, with orders never to surrender, Onoda remained hidden with 3 comrades, clinging to the illusion of combat for nearly 3 decades. By the time his former commanding officer arrived to relieve him on March 9, 1974, Onoda was the last survivor, still armed, still in his 30-year-old uniform, still waiting for a war that had long since moved on. When asked why he had held out so long, he replied simply, "I was waiting for the war to come back to me. I never imagined it would leave me behind forever." This is the essence of what terrified Japan. The island-hopping strategy didn't just win battles, it invalidated the very meaning of warfare for the Japanese warrior. Their culture, their honor, their bushido, their painstakingly prepared defenses, every calculation and assumption about fighting the enemy had been rendered meaningless. 300,000 troops on bypassed islands were not defeated, they were erased. They tended gardens, fished, starved slowly, and watched the war proceed without them. They were not conquered. They were ignored. The genius of the strategy lay in its refusal to engage. It denied the Japanese the battle they had trained for, the sacrifice they had been taught to cherish, the validation of dying for the emperor. The terror it inspired came not from explosions, but from absence. It was a war of time, logistics, and indifference where the passage of days itself became a weapon. Japanese fortifications, once symbols of invincibility, became prisons. Their soldiers, prepared for heroic death, endured the agony of meaningless survival. The lesson is clear. The island-hopping campaign was a revolution in warfare. It did not attack positions. It attacked purpose. It did not kill men. It killed meaning. It turned the Pacific Ocean from a battlefield into a corridor of inevitable victory, leaving Japanese strongholds to rot in isolation. And for the warriors of the Empire of the Rising Sun, the most terrible lesson was that a soldier can be defeated not by an enemy, but by irrelevance. The setting sun cast the longest shadows, and in those shadows, forgotten armies slowly faded into nothing. Witnesses not to their defeat, but to their absence. They had glimpsed the future of warfare, and in that future they had no place.